Good evening. My name is Keith Cole, and I'm the Executive Director for the Wolf River Conservancy. On behalf of our board and our staff, I want to welcome you all here this evening. We're very excited about tonight's program, Science and Conservation for Birds and Humans on Working Lands in the Mississippi Delta, presented by Dr. Jason Huckstoma. Our presentation tonight is part of our ongoing educational outreach to the community. Kathy Justice, our Director of Education, leads that effort for us in our community in a variety of ways, such as tonight's lecture. We also want to acknowledge our presenting sponsors for this year's lecture series. Our corporate sponsor is Buckman, and our foundation sponsor is the Crawford Howard Family Foundation. We'd like to also take this time to recognize our 2022 corporate benefactors who provide such generous support throughout the year, such as AutoZone, Brother International, FedEx, Hyde Family Foundation, International Paper, Jim Karras Subaru, Ring Container Technologies, and Silvamo for their ongoing support. Thank you all. Of course, all of our supporters, whether they're corporations, community organizations, or individual donors, are all important to us, critically important to us in allowing us to continue to deliver on our mission, the protection and enhancement of the Wolf River and its watershed as a sustainable natural resource. Please remember, you can always visit wolfriver.org to learn more about all of our programs, to safely and securely donate online, or just to learn more about our mission and our current land conservation work. Some housekeeping details: please do not attempt to record tonight's program. It's being recorded for you. If you've registered, you'll get a link in the next few days that allow you to rewatch the program or share it with others that might have an interest. Also, if you have questions during the program, please use the Q&A feature in your link. Kathy Justice will be monitoring those questions at the end of the program. She'll be presenting them to our presenter. Now it's my pleasure to present to you our honored speaker and lecturer, Dr. Jason Huckstoma. He's a professor of biology at the University of Mississippi, where his research addresses a diversity of ecological questions, often inspired by interactions between plants and other fungi, but also animal responses to temporary wetlands and agricultural landscapes. Jason teaches microecology, ornithology, and other courses at Ole Miss, and is both a mushroom and bird expert. He is the president of the nonprofit Delta Wind Birds organization. Delta Wind Birds is a conservation nonprofit based in Oxford, Mississippi, working to conserve existing wetlands, educate the public on the importance of wetlands, promote ecotourism around birds and wetlands, and especially to create temporary wetlands on private lands in the Delta, including crop farms. Please help me welcome tonight's presenter, Jason, to our virtual stage. Jason, welcome.
Thank you very much, Keith. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to speak to everyone here this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with my slides. So the first thing I want to do is explain the title of our nonprofit organization. Keith mentioned that I'm the president of Delta Wind Birds. Some of you I see in the audience I know are supporters of ours already. So you've heard this before, but the name of our organization, the Delta part, usually doesn't confuse people. A lot of organizations in our area are called Delta something or another, but Windbird often causes people to pause and wonder what that really is. So I want to explain. It really is what we think of as a poetic synonym for a shorebird. Shorebirds are a group of birds that I'll tell you more about in a minute. But this term, windbirds, comes from the great naturalist Peter Matheson, who wrote a book about them, first published in the late 1960s. And there is this passage where he said, "The restlessness of shorebirds, their kinship with the distance and swift seasons, the wistful signal of their voices down the long coastlines of the world make them, for me, the most affecting of wild creatures. I think of them as birds of the wind, as wind birds." So that's where that comes from, and birders who love shorebirds sometimes call them wind birds, and that's where the name of our organization comes from. A little bit about these birds themselves, and I want to, before I forget, acknowledge the photography, especially of Larry Pace, whose photos grace many of the slides, but we have many excellent volunteer photographers who contributed photos for these kinds of presentations. So the windbirds are the shorebirds, and it's a diverse group of birds, some of which are pictured here. They range in size and shape, with some of them having longer legs than others, some of them have longer bills. And these things, these traits correlate with their ecology. I'll just go through a couple of examples. First, on the top left, the Wilson snipe. Snipe, in fact, are not mythical birds that you are sent out into the woods to find only as a trick. They're a real bird that nest further north than here, and a lot of them spend the winter in Mississippi and Tennessee. That's a photo from the nesting grounds in North Dakota. American woodcock is a bit of an oddball because as a shorebird, it doesn't actually spend any time, very much at least, on the shore of wetlands, which is where a lot of these birds get their names. American woodcocks are particular to woodlands and creeks and open fields near those areas. And they spend the winter here as well, and then have a fabulous habit of getting going on their mating rituals in early spring, late winter even, while they're still here. And we often lead a field trip to see that. Killdeer right in the middle is probably the most common and most recognizable of the shorebirds. It's often called killdee. They are known for nesting in this area. They're one of the few shorebirds that nests in our region. They lay their eggs in small, shallow, rocky cups in places like parking lots and baseball diamonds. And it's a miracle they don't get all of their eggs run over by cars and trampled by softball players, but they do really well. The killdeer is a very abundant species. On the top right, black-necked stilt is one of our beautiful nesting birds as well. They nest out in the delta and wetlands, and they have long legs. That's what they're named for. And similar in size, but even bigger, with a different shaped bill that has this sort of graceful upswept shape, is the American avocet. And avocets are a migratory species that does not nest here, but they pass through in big numbers. They spend the winter down in places like Mexico and northern South America and come through the delta in large numbers on their way further north to nest. On the bottom in the center is Wilson's phalarope, a fascinating species, which is a bit of an exception where the males are actually more brightly colored. The females are more brightly colored than the males, and the males have taken on a lot of the typical female roles in the bird world of mainly they are the ones who raise watch the eggs and raise the young after they hatch. And the females are the brightly colored ones. That's a female Wilson's phalarope there. Lesser and greater yellowlegs are a bit nondescript, but they're very charming birds. If you get to watch them, they're active hunters and one of the most abundant groups of birds that come through. And it's always a bit of a challenge when they're not standing right next to each other to tell them apart. And then last but not least, but actually least, is the least sandpiper shown on the right there. That's a great photo from my friend Mark Dolan. And the least sandpiper I appreciate so much because it is the smallest of our shorebirds in North America. They're the size of a sparrow, but they are also the most abundant, and they are so resilient and talented. This winter, we were out in the Delta, and I'll tell you more about this project soon, but trying to catch shorebirds for a tagging project, and we hit a cold snap, and the habitat froze over, and the next day we had least sandpipers literally skating on the ice out there, kind of wondering what the heck we were doing in their world that was frozen over, but they were fine, finding food even on top of the ice. So that's just a bit about our shorebirds in terms of their morphology. Their size and shape and the shape of their bills and their legs really influences where they tend to find food. So the ones with longer bills tend to probe more deep in the mud or in the soft ground. The ones with longer legs are able to do that in deeper water, and that allows them access to different kinds of habitat, different kinds of food. A lot of these birds eat insects and also other kinds of invertebrate animals, little clams, worms. They eat a ton of little worms, the worms that are larvae of flies, especially. One of the most fascinating things about shorebirds, and what really has impressed me about them, is their epic migrations. A lot of them nest quite a bit further north of here in the Arctic, in Canada or Alaska. And they spend the winter as far south as the southern tip of South America. And in between, they have to make long migratory flights. Some of them make relatively short hops from bay to bay, down, for example, down the West Coast. Others will make larger jumps from all the way from northern Canada down to the Mississippi Delta, and then from there to Mexico. And other species make epic jumps, staging in northern Canada, maybe stopping on the East Coast before then flying to Brazil or even further in South America in one big flight. And the physiology that this requires and the behavioral refinement that this requires is really one of the wonders of the natural world. I want to tell you about, to me, the most incredible example of bird migration that has been discovered yet. And this is a member of the group of shorebirds called the godwits. The bar-tailed godwit is arguably the world's most impressive migrant. It nests in Alaska and spends the winter in New Zealand. And yes, you're reading that correctly. How they get from Alaska to New Zealand is one single direct flight. This takes them, give or take, 9 days of nonstop flying, during which they're flying constantly at about 25 miles an hour. It's about a 5,600 mile flight. They don't stop at all to eat or to drink. And this was only discovered within the last couple of decades when GPS trackers were put on backpacks on the backs of these birds. And the scientists kept expecting to see these birds when they were tracking them, expecting them to stop. They flew right over Hawaii without even, maybe they looked down. We don't know whether they glanced down at Hawaii, but they did not stop. And it's turned out that their physiology is so adapted to this. Their internal organs shrink in advance of this flight to save weight. They put on a ton of mass of fat, which layers over their muscle. And then during the journey, they burn both fat and muscle. That muscle, actually, the deterioration of the muscle during the flight is on purpose. And that's what generates a lot of their water. When protein is burned, a lot of the water is generated that they're able to absorb directly, preventing them from needing to stop to drink water, actually. So it's quite amazing. And a lot of shorebirds do some version of this. Not all of them are as dramatic as the bar-tailed godwit, but there are smaller species that do some, make some incredible migration jumps, almost as impressive as the bar-tailed godwit. Another part of their story, though, is that a lot of shorebird species are in peril. Roughly 60% of shorebird species are on the decline. 2 of them are federally endangered, the piping plover, at least in some of its range, and the Hawaiian stilt. Snowy plover and red knot are federally threatened. And in the Wildlife Action Plan for the state of Mississippi, we have 4 species listed there: the lesser yellowlegs, pectoral sandpiper, semi-palmated sandpiper, and dunlin. Eskimo curlew is extinct. The causes of these declines are complex. It really got kicked off more than 100 years ago when hunting shorebirds was very popular, and they were hunted in large numbers, and it was devastating for some species that were more vulnerable than others. Some that were very affectionate to their kin and would fly back to inspect a bird that had been shot and then get shot themselves. Some species are still hunted along their migratory pathways, especially in some Caribbean island nations and northern South America. But habitat loss and habitat degradation is a big part of it as well. And it's complex, of course, because we need great habitat for them in their breeding range in the north, in their wintering range in the south in several places, and during their migration in many stopover points along the way. So one of the most important things we can do is help to create and protect that those patches of habitat. In our area, we are focused on the Mississippi River Valley, or the lower Mississippi River Valley, the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, or often for short, we just call it the Delta, which is pictured here, the colored area here. And it's estimated that more than 500,000 shorebirds migrate and stop through here on their way north and south each spring and fall. 27 or so species of shorebirds. And in this region, the main conservation problem that we can help to address, to help remedy, help reverse, help to slow the declines of shorebird populations is limited shorebird stopover habitat, especially in fall when we have drier weather and there's not as much water on the landscape. In spring, we get a lot of rain at the right time of year, and there tends to be a lot of big patches of flooded fields that create temporary habitat for these birds. But in fall, it's often too dry, and it's very few and far between when these birds stop through here. And historically, that was not the case. Historically, this was a vast forested wetland, and though it was forested, there was still plenty of good shorebird habitat because it was full of bayous and backwaters that would fluctuate in their water levels, exposing muddy edges, big open mud flats. Some of you may have seen that when an oxbow lake that is cut off from a river dries down in a dry summer and dry fall, it can become a giant mudflat. And those were really important natural habitats for migratory shorebirds. There are fewer and fewer of these kinds of habitats available now because most of this region has been reclaimed or taken over by humans for agricultural production. So one solution to this is to try to find and protect natural habitat that still exists. Another part of the solution is to try to help create temporary wetland habitat within those agricultural landscapes. So what does Delta Windbirds do to try to help? In fact, our mission really is composed of 4 broad points. One of them indeed is the creation of stopover habitat. Temporary wetlands, we've started to call them sometimes pop-up wetlands on working lands such as farms, private duck hunting clubs, and other private properties where water levels can be controlled. We also conduct research on the ecosystem benefits of temporary wetlands to connect habitat creation with all of the downstream effects that it can have, the benefits. We do engage in protection of natural wetlands and, really importantly, outreach and education around the value of wetlands, and as a part of that, trying to promote ecotourism and economic benefits that may come with the promotion of these habitats and education around them. So I want to tell you a little bit first about our efforts to create habitat on working lands. This is one example. Four Winds Refuge is the owner's name for this private property in Humphreys County, Mississippi, which is about a half hour to 45 minutes southwest of Greenwood and Grenada. And it's right in the middle of the Delta. And this is a former catfish farm that has been now repurposed as a private recreational property. And the owners, when we met them, hadn't had the property for very long, but they had a vision to manage it for many different uses, including waterfowl hunting, but also and other kinds of hunting, some fishing, some cultivation of crawfish, some cultivation of bees, and protection of and support of wildlife populations in general. They've been working with us since 2013, and we've both learned a lot along the way, but it's become a really great example of what can be done on private properties in our region. Four Winds Refuge, the owners have been really willing to engage with us and to learn about how to create habitat specifically for shorebirds, for migratory shorebirds at the right time of year, which is the fall migration. And that really kicks off in August. It really, in fact, starts in July, big numbers in August and September, and then into October. And then we transition in November into wintering birds and some shorebirds that are passing through on their way to the Gulf, but maybe even stopping and staying in the Delta for the winter. Here is one image from quite a few years ago at Four Winds Refuge, where this former catfish pond that had water, it was full of water up about 3 feet, and they drained it. And when you do this, what happens is the aquatic invertebrates that were in that water column are concentrated down onto the mud, and that mud is exposed where insect larvae are living, and shorebirds, many species of shorebirds can take advantage of this, and they dive in out of their migratory pathway almost immediately. Within hours, we see them accumulating on these mudflats. Here's a closer image. This is just from, in fact, a few weeks ago when we held our spring tour at this site. This is really what it should look like. And we're not paying these landowners to create spring shorebird habitat, but they are so dedicated to the cause and excited to help that they are going out of their way to create excellent shorebird habitat during spring migration as well. And you can see the birds are happy to take advantage of it. Pictured in front of you are long-billed dowitchers and both species of yellowlegs, stilt sandpipers, least and semi-palmated sandpipers, and several other species that we saw that day, as well as blue-winged teal. I should say that teal and other waterfowl species, but especially blue-winged teal, tend to benefit from these same exact habitats. Teal habitat is shorebird habitat. And here's an image from our field trip in April with some of our supporters and field trip participants enjoying excellent views of these birds and learning how to identify them. So we hope that you will join us on one of these field trips in the future. One question that we were asking ourselves, though, for several years, after having had some success working with private landowners on these kinds of properties that I was just showing you, duck clubs and the like, was whether we could make habitat on crop fields that would be sustainable and effective. Can we make good shorebird habitat on crop fields in the fall? And could we do it without pumping groundwater? Groundwater is a really valuable commodity for agriculture and for human consumption everywhere in the world, and in the Mississippi Delta, it's being depleted. The aquifer is being depleted by all the groundwater wells that are tapping into it for agriculture. And so we didn't want to contribute to that decline of groundwater when we're making wildlife habitat. And so we were seeking opportunities to try to make wildlife habitat without pumping groundwater. So we hit on the idea of working with farmers who haven't worked with the USDA to install what are called tailwater recovery systems. What you can see in the background of these 3 flooded fields here, look in the background, there's a couple of narrow reservoirs, and those are called tailwater reservoirs. And this farmer here, in fact, has a system of ditches and leveled fields that feed all of the runoff water into ditches that are then, where the water is then flows and pumps and is pumped back into those reservoirs. This kind of system, he has 2 of these on his farm. The other one is off in the distance against the Sunflower River. And this was the first farmer we worked with. This is near Indianola in Sunflower County, Mississippi. And what we thought to try to do was to take advantage of the fact that in the fall, these farmers often have extra or excess surface water left in these reservoirs after having used it all summer to irrigate their fields. The system is efficient, it catches rainfall, it catches runoff, and that extra water then, we pumped it, I think for the first time in 2018, we pumped some of this extra water back out onto 3 of these fields, and you can see what that looked like here, to create temporary shallow water and mudflats to try to attract migratory shorebirds. And it worked really, really well. Immediately we were attracting shorebirds. The killdeer found it first within hours, and we had yellowlegs and pectoral sandpipers zooming in out of the sky within a couple of days. We were really happy with that. In fact, we worked with this farmer on this idea for 3 years, in the fall of 2018, 2019, and 2020. And what we were learning was how to try to integrate this wildlife habitat management with an active and successful crop farm. This is specifically a place where he was growing corn, and corn is harvested fairly early in the fall, usually in late August in this area. And so he was able to flood by early September and create good shorebird habitat for a bulk of the shorebird migration. And we use a design where we had 3 flooded fields and 3 unflooded fields so that we could compare what was going on with this management treatment versus without it. And our overarching hypothesis was that these kinds of temporary wetlands may benefit, on crop fields may benefit not only wildlife, but there may be benefits for ecosystems and for the farms themselves. If you think about it, in general, wetland function has been removed from these systems where it was historically there for thousands of years. So putting that natural wetland function back into these systems, even only for a few months, may have many benefits that we don't expect. I'm showing this image to the left here because our work on this farm was featured in an article in Living Bird magazine, which you can get if you are a member of the Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology. That was in their summer issue last year. So look for that if you're interested. So we knew that we could create bird habitat. We also hypothesized that it might have benefits for soil conservation. It is known that just trapping runoff on fields prevents the loss of soil sediment. So if these fields all have water control structures on at least down at the bottom end, sometimes 2 or 3 of them, and you just can put boards in those control structures and prevent the water from washing off. And in order to hold this habitat water, we had to put those boards in. And we hypothesized that just holding that water and preventing it from running off would keep soil on those fields and keep it from eroding during storms in the fall and winter. Denitrification is a process that we also hypothesized would be promoted by this practice. This comes from my research colleague and collaborator, Jason Taylor, at the USDA Research Laboratory here in Oxford. And denitrification is a natural process that happens in wetlands where microbes transform dissolved nitrogen in the water into gaseous nitrogen that is pumped into the air, essentially. And this gets them a little bit of energy, but it's very beneficial in a crop system potentially for reducing downstream pollution so that when this water runs off eventually, there is less nitrogen injected into downstream bodies of water. That nitrogen, if it goes downstream into rivers, into the Mississippi River, into the Gulf of Mexico, has the potential and has been shown to create harmful algal blooms associated with oxygen depletion and creating what's called a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So if we can reduce the amount of nitrogen running off these farms, that could have a big benefit downstream for those ecosystems. Now, in talking with farmers about these kinds of practices, trying to recruit farmers to try this on their farms, I thought I would tell you about some of the concerns that have been raised, and these are valid concerns that we've been grappling with and talking with farmers about. One is that fall flooding like this takes time away from their harvest operations and from their field prep. A lot of farmers, most farmers in this region, do their field prep for spring planting. They do a lot of it in the fall so that they don't have to try to get into a wet, muddy field in the spring to do it. They worry that this kind of flooding may erode their beds that have already been prepped. It may cause the stubble in the field to drift, which could interfere with planting in the spring. It could delay getting into fields in the spring if the fields are still wet from this flooding. They were worried that it would harden their soil, which could impede planting or reduce crop yield. And there's a concern by some farmers that this flooding practice would somehow lock up their phosphorus and reduce their crop yield because of reduced phosphorus availability. So we were cognizant of all of these concerns, and yet we had very promising data from this one farm that I'm going to show you here in a minute. And our farmer in Sunflower County has expressed to us that none of these concerns ended up being significant for him. It's just one example so far, and we've been working with 2 other farmers this past year that we're still gathering feedback from. But so far, these concerns have not borne out to be either significant or and preventing him from having a net benefit of engaging in these practices. So let me show you some of the, just a little bit of a background on that nutrient lockup hypothesis that I mentioned down at the bottom of the concerns. Some of this comes from the Mississippi State Soil and Plant Nutrient Lab, which for many years was publishing, giving farmers this feedback that was warning them of phosphorus becoming unavailable after fields were flooded. And this is a phenomenon known as flooded field syndrome. And there was some evidence from studies on Midwestern corn and soy fields after floods up there in 1993 that there was something going on with phosphorus. And so this was one of the reasons for concern. Some of this came also from an influential scientific paper that was published back in 2013 on the effect of winter flooding on soybean yield and other aspects of the system in rice fields. This was in 5 by 8 meter rice fields in Stoneville, Mississippi. They used groundwater, not surface water. And this was after rice harvest, and they saw that it resulted in accelerated straw decomposition and weed control, which was good, but they also saw reduced soybean yield in subsequent years, and they proposed several different mechanisms for that. So this is out there, and for this reason, among others, we really wanted to study all of these aspects of the ecosystem that we were creating out there and understand all of the downstream consequences of these wildlife flooding practices in these agricultural systems. So our initial focus in this system at this farm in Indianola was on quantifying bird usage. And in fact, we found that the shorebirds used it like crazy. Here are some data. On average per field, we saw upwards of 1,000 shorebirds in flooded fields and very few in the dry fields. This is not surprising. Below here is a photo by Larry Pace of least sandpipers at one of those fields. On the top right, you can see long-billed dowitchers, lesser least sandpipers, lesser yellowlegs, greater yellowlegs, changing over time in number during the fall migration on these sites. This wasn't surprising to us. We were excited and happy about it, but perhaps more intriguing was this hypothesis of denitrification and sediment retention on these fields. And we set out in partnership with Jason Taylor at the USDA lab to test these hypotheses. And this is Jason collecting a sediment core, which he then brings back to his laboratory in Oxford and then studies the nutrient and gas fluxes in those sediment cores to understand what happens in these flooded systems. This is a couple of students who were working with us at the time, Pablo and Rachel, who were helping to collect samples. They were also collecting samples of the insects and other invertebrates in the system to quantify how the flooding was creating food for these migratory birds. And we measured, in fact, in these 2 fall seasons, denitrification, sediment runoff, birds, macroinvertebrate densities, and subsequent soybean crop yield. And what we found was very substantial denitrification. This is that process of pumping nitrogen out of the water into the air. And the total amount of nitrogen pumped out of one of these fields was roughly half of that was applied to those fields the previous year. So this is all nitrogen that would have run off, dissolved in the water downstream into streams and rivers and the Gulf of Mexico eventually. We also saw substantial sediment retention in the flooded fields. So the green dots are flooded fields and sediment retention over time on different samples. You can also see on the left is that jar there is from a sample that ran off from a flooded field. You can see how little sediment is trapped in that water. On the right is from an unflooded field, just water sample just full of soil running off of that field. And that results probably in, only a few millimeters of soil loss every year, but that adds up over time to deplete this valuable soil resource in our farm region. The most exciting thing, though, I would say that emerged from these 2 years of studying was that subsequent soybean yield actually increased on the flooded fields by about 4 to 5%. compared to the unflooded fields. And this happened 2 years in a row. It was even a little bit larger than that in the second year. And this was very exciting. We were hoping just for no difference in yield, subsequent yield, because there's so many other benefits of these temporary floods. But to see that subsequent crop yield actually increased was a big, pleasant surprise, because this is one of the main concerns of farmers. And if that's not a concern, it's much more likely to be adopted by increasing numbers of farmers going forward. So we had many questions after these 2 years of work, though. First of all, when we flood with tailwater on these corn and soybean fields, are these yield benefits going to be consistent year to year and especially among different farms? What are the effects on the soil? What is the mechanism of those yield benefits? And is it in the soil? What about the soil? What's happening with phosphorus and nitrogen in the soil? Also, does it matter if we flood only in the fall versus only in the winter? And does it matter where we are in the crop rotation if we flood after a corn harvest versus a soybean harvest? With these questions and the data that we had already, we went to the EPA and applied for a grant and received a grant last year from their Gulf of Mexico Farmer to Farmer program. And that grant is funding currently a research partnership among the University of Mississippi, the USDA, Mississippi State and Extension, and Delta Windbirds to address all of the questions on that previous slide. So in a couple of years, I'll be able to return, if you like, and tell you all about those results. And we're studying this across 4 farm sites right now, and we're going to expand that next year to include 8 to 10 additional farm sites in the Sunflower River Basin of the Mississippi Delta. So far, what we've studied is 5 different treatments: a control that is unflooded, a passive flood with only boards holding and preventing natural rain from running off, and then fall flood, winter flood, and a fall plus winter flood. And then we're measuring all of those things that I've mentioned before. And we're doing this over 3 years during a corn and soy rotation. So, and then of course, we're also talking with these farmers, and we're trying to expand the reach of farmers who are engaged in learning about these practices through field days and networking events. That's a big part of the project as well. So this is an example of one of our field sites from this past fall and winter season. Here's Emma Counts, who was our bird counter this season. She's a graduate student of mine at the University of Mississippi. This is Victoria Simic, who is a USDA employee and also a biology graduate student in our department, working on the, she's going to be working actually on amphibians in the system and how they respond to these treatments. Here she's installing depth sensors in the fields. And just briefly, I want to mention another project that's being sponsored entirely by Delta Windbirds that we will really be kicking off for real in September. This is the Mississippi Delta Shorebird tracking project. So at these sites, we've installed a MODIS tracking tower. This is Hal Mitchell, who some of you may know, and his MODIS tower. Here's a photo of a shorebird with a radio tag on it. This is from New Jersey Audubon, from a similar project there. And this is our team assessing the mud and the conditions back when we started to, we explored and got started on this back in January. And we're really optimistic about catching our first shorebirds in September. And we're going to be radio tracking them mainly to learn how long do they stay, because that's something we really don't know, how long these individual birds and different species are staying at our sites. And that'll really help us estimate how many birds we're helping with this habitat. We're also hoping to get some data on where they go next after visiting our sites. Where are they headed and how far south into South America if they get that far. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears and with my remaining time tell you a little bit more about what we do in the realm of protection of natural wetlands, and especially in outreach and education, engaging in communities. In terms of habitat protection, we have focused really on a particular zone of natural wetlands in the Central Delta near that Four Winds Refuge that I mentioned earlier. And this is at Sky Lake in Humphreys County, just down the road from Four Winds Refuge. This is a really special place if you haven't been there already. On the right is one of the largest bald cypress trees left in the southeastern United States, and you can walk about a half-mile boardwalk through the bald cypress swamp there, which is really typical of what these wetlands used to look like before agriculture, before a lot of most of the big trees were cut down. And it's an amazing place that you have to get to if you haven't already been. I know you all appreciate wetlands already. If you're a wetland enthusiast, you have to make it to Sky Lake and walk the boardwalk. This is on a state managed natural area, a wildlife management area. And nearby there, outlined in yellow, is the Sky Lake Nature Reserve that Delta Windbirds, our organization, purchased and is managing, just starting within the last couple of years. And at that nature reserve, we are fostering and protecting the similar wetland habitat to what is found over on the other side of the lake. But we were particularly attracted to this site because as a nature reserve, this is now the only public access to see this natural oxbow lake called Sky Lake, which in particular years when it's been very dry, when this habitat is needed the most, it creates acres, hundreds of acres of natural shorebird habitat, mudflats and shallow water that benefits not only migratory shorebirds, but also large numbers of wading birds like herons and egrets, lots of waterfowl and other similar birds. We invite you to join us on a field trip at our nature reserve, where we're continuing to develop infrastructure going forward, and we're happy to lead you there. It's usually a stop on our spring and fall nature tour, which visits the boardwalk, our nature reserve here, and the Four Winds Refuge all in one tour. So that's what you can expect if you want to join us for our next tour in the fall. It's also a great spot for outdoor recreation. Kayaking and canoeing is one of the best places to see our nature reserve, which is mostly pictured right in front of you there. You can kayak or canoe through the flooded forest or on the outside in the open lake here. And we also really appreciate the opportunity to use these beautiful sites to teach people, especially young people, but people of all ages, about the value of wetlands and their natural history and their biodiversity. These are some images from our efforts just in the last year with student groups out at our nature reserve and at the boardwalk. So this is from our spring field trip on the Delta Windbirds Sky Lake Nature Reserve. In the background behind me, you can see an example of a prothonotary warbler nest box, which I'll tell you more about here in a minute. Our nature reserve is an important site for us to promote and allow and facilitate student research. On the top are two college students who are engaged in a research project there to actually sample and identify the fungal biodiversity in the soil of these bottomland hardwoods, which is very poorly understood as a phenomenon. The student pictured here in a canoe with her mother behind her is Nora Bruce, who is a high school student in Oxford, who has been engaged with us in helping us with the prothonotary warbler nest box project. So she monitored more than a dozen prothonotary warbler nest boxes on our property at the nature reserve last summer, and is continuing with that effort this summer, helping to document the benefits of those nest boxes for this golden swamp warbler, which is a great ambassador and representative for these wetland habitats. As you probably know, very dependent on these wetland habitats and really emblematic of these amazing places. We are also engaging in local communities in that area, including Belzona, which is a small town that has come into hard times economically, especially since the decline in the catfish industry in the recent decades. And we're doing everything we can to promote ecotourism in this area, to bring people to Belzona to patronize the excellent restaurants there and other opportunities, cultural opportunities that they have. Pictured here is some Delta Windbirds board members engaging with members of the Belzona community, talking with them about a site for a potential nature mural to be painted by Victoria Daly, who is our artist in residence this spring with Delta Windbirds. And she has made plans to paint a mural on the side of a building in Belzona that will represent the biodiversity and wildlife of Sky Lake, and which would be part of a larger series of these murals in the Delta, which we hope to curate and call something like the Conservation Mural Trail in the Delta. And our hope is that this could be publicized as a way of promoting not only education about wetlands and biodiversity, but also bringing more people to these communities to not only appreciate those habitats, but to spend money in those communities and engage in those communities. And we're currently raising funds to pay for this mural. If that's something that you think is a good idea, we'd love your help with that. I also lastly want to mention a really cool thing that just happened recently, and this is a partnership we have with Bird Collective. Bird Collective is a really cool organization that just was founded a couple of years ago. It's a group of artists and birders and creative designers who care about birds and their declining populations, and who work with nonprofit organizations like ours to design collections of apparel and gifts that feature birds and biodiversity and habitats. And then they generously donate 20% of their profits to whatever conservation organization they are sponsoring at the moment. And right now, during the spring of 2022, Delta Windbirds is that organization. So on their website, they have a really nice long form article about our work, featuring some great photography from Mark Dolan. And you should really check out their collection. They have some awesome t-shirts, some of which were designed by Mississippi artists. They all feature birds that our habitat is helping to benefit, such as the great blue heron on this shirt to the left, and all of these wetland species featured in this bald cypress t-shirt that I really like on the right there. One of the t-shirts was actually stained with Mississippi mud, and a couple of different Mississippi artists were involved in creating some of these designs. So check that out if you have a chance, and it makes great gifts and a way to support us and have a neat reward for it at the same time. So I'm going to stop there. I'll just quickly, before I finish, I'll explain this painting on the left. This is actually a print that was painted by David Sibley for Delta Windbirds a few years ago, and we were able to sell prints of that painting to benefit our work. And I wish we had more of them. And I still appreciate that design. It goes from the elegant American Avocet on the top left, which has that beautiful upsweeping bill, to the more subtle but equally impressive semi-palmated sandpiper kind of walking through the legs of that Avocet. And that's really, where it all started. And what we're trying to promote is the biology of those birds and appreciation of them, and how wetlands can actually benefit not only those birds, but also humans in all kinds of ways. Thank you for your attention. If you want to learn more about our organization, you can visit our website, deltawindbirds.org. You can send me an email if you have any questions, or just want to make sure you get updates from us. You can sign up to receive occasional updates. We are on Facebook and Instagram, and pretty easy to find there. And I'm Jason Huckstoma. I'm happy to take any questions from the audience. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jason. That was just a wonderful presentation. I was very interested. I'm going to wait for some questions to come up, and I have a couple of my own. The first is, I remember some work with catfish farms and drawing down those ponds, and you discussed mainly the agriculture component. I just wondered if you could talk about the catfish farms as well.
Yeah, sure. So catfish farms have the potential to create great habitat in this realm. Those ponds are flooded all the time, and they have the ability to pump that water out. And we've worked with some catfish farmers over the years, but we haven't had as much luck engaging them as we initially expected we would, partly because there's an overlap in the fall between the best time of year to grow a catfish and shorebird migration. And so sometimes it happens by chance because these farmers have to empty a pond in order to maintain it, to reshape it, to make repairs. And we see these shorebirds flocking to it like crazy, like they prefer catfish pond habitat like no other when they're drained. But catfish farmers have a difficult time doing that on purpose because the fall, that warm season in the fall, right when the shorebirds are coming through, is really a productive time on those catfish farms. And so the overlap, the timing is not great. So we have ended up focusing more on other systems in the region, like these crop farms, where the habitat that's created is a better overlap, or lack of overlap actually, with the activities of the landowners.
Okay, well, that's interesting. And then also I was curious about, I've been reading a lot about regenerative agriculture and some of the like no-till farming and rotating crops. And I'm wondering if flooding fields could be part of that, the kind of mosaic of techniques that some farmers are trying to transition to make agriculture more sustainable.
Yeah, that's a good question. Indeed, there are interactive effects of these different kinds of management practices. One thing that we've seen, for example, is that among just the farmers we've worked with, there's a lot of variation in how much tillage they do, how much plowing of the soil. And when they do more plowing, more tillage, we see less benefits to the birds, certainly. Because what's happening is that the invertebrate populations in the soil are not as robust. They don't respond very well to all of that tillage. And then the birds just don't come and use that habitat. They fly in, they test it, they don't find very much food, and they move on somewhere else. So that's one way that that some of these other practices could be integrated. One thing we haven't thought a lot about is how different cover crops, for example, might integrate with these practices, but that would be something we might want to investigate going forward. Cover cropping is a really potentially beneficial practice of, planting a plant on the crop field during the non-crop season that can help hold soil and maybe return nutrients to the soil. Maybe provide, maybe some of those cover crops could actually also feed into that subsequent wetland cycle if we're creating temporary wetlands, or maybe would respond to our temporary wetlands and would grow subsequently after the flooding practice is done. For example, maybe we could flood only in the fall and then plant a cover crop that would go through the winter and would help stabilize the soil during the rest of the year when we're not flooding, for example. So yeah, it's a good question, and that's something we need to work on and think about more going forward.
Yeah, I have all kinds of questions about that. Like, I wonder if it would even improve soil fertility and crop production down the road. But that's another subject. So I got a couple of questions that have just come in. First of all, are there some standard tours or programs for 10 to 12-year-olds or anything that we could view on your site? Also, we have an interest in bringing a small kayak club from North Mississippi. Do we need to make reservations or schedule a date, or do we just show up?
Okay, good questions. Let me take those kind of one at a time. For 10 to 12-year-olds, well, first of all, I will say I have one short, or two or three actually short recorded presentations on the biology of migratory shorebirds that are geared towards children. And I don't know if there would be a good way for Kathy to get you a link, Beth, but that's something I would be happy to send a link to, and we should probably, appreciate you bringing it up, I should probably link those on our website so that they're easy for people to find. But more generally, and perhaps more interestingly, we do custom tours sometimes for groups of children, and I'm happy to talk about that anytime. You could email me to set up a special tour. We also welcome children on any of our group trips, any of our field trips, and we often have children on our field trips with their parents, and I think we're pretty good at it. We have members of our board, Christina Mitchell, for example, who previously worked at Strawberry Plains Audubon Center and did a great job engaging children. And we have a good team of leaders on our field trips that engage with children really well. So you're welcome to bring them on any of our field trips. But please feel free to inquire sometime about a special event if that's something you're interested in. Also, we partner, I partner, and sometimes our organization does, with Robin Whitfield and the Lee Tart Nature Preserve in Grenada. And the Lee Tart Nature Preserve has a robust series of events that are very well geared towards children that we sometimes have helped with. You can find them on Facebook as well. Robin Whitfield is really amazing, and they do a great job of engaging with children. A kayak club. So you are welcome to go and just show up at this site. In fact, if you go to our website, you can click on the Sky Lake link. There's good information there, including instructions, maps, etc., on how to get to these sites. There are 2 places to kayak and canoe at Sky Lake. One of them is at the boardwalk, which is on the north end of the lake, and that's on the state land. There's a put-in off of a parking lot there, and there's even a map that you can pull up on your phone by pointing it at the QR code on the sign in the parking lot. There's bathrooms there. That's where I recommend starting after you've driven a couple of hours to get there. And you can go through there. You can paddle right up to these 1,000-year-old bald cypress trees, and it's really amazing. It's a bit, the navigation there, you have to kind of keep an eye on your map a little bit, and because the route is not, I will say, it's not marked particularly well, but it's not a very big area, and you can't get lost completely, especially if you have a phone that's well protected in a waterproof bag. Don't make that mistake, which I have. That's a great place to start, and there's a map you can download from our website even. The link is there. Also, at our nature reserve, you are also welcome to just show up anytime with no reservations or anything to explore by foot along the shore. We have a trail that's mowed from the entrance at the north end of our reserve, but also you can just you can park along, the parking there is only along the road right now. We're working on that. But you can park along the road and just drag a kayak or a canoe right into the lake. And at the north end of our reserve, you can see the lake. It's right there, and it's all yours. And you can just pull in, and it's a great way to explore right there. And I like to paddle from the north end of our reserve south through our flooded forest and then out onto the open lake and kind of circumnavigate the edge of the lake. It makes a nice circular loop that takes just 1 or 2 hours, depending on how much time you have. And it's all different times of year. You can see different things there. Sometimes there are really cool nesting birds, like prothonotary warblers are right there right now nesting in our nesting boxes. And so you may be able to paddle or walk right past our occupied prothonotary warbler boxes, and I really encourage you to check those out. So yeah, feel free to just show up, and there's lots of information under the Sky Lake link on our website.
Okay, and here's, I think, probably our final question. This person is, I am dismayed by the clear cutting of land for development. Could you please comment on destruction of hardwoods to migrating birds and loss of carbon dioxide intake / oxygen output?
Yeah, well, Diane, I share your concern. Habitat loss is estimated to be one of the top 2 or 3 greatest threats to bird populations, not only migrating birds, but also nesting birds. And one of the main reasons, which may be intuitive to most of you, is that trees support insect populations. Oak trees, for example, have been estimated to host hundreds, like 200 to 300 or more different species of worms, of the larvae of moths and butterflies. And those worms, those little worms, are the food for migrating birds like warblers and vireos and tanagers. And when you cut down an oak tree or a hickory tree, you're cutting down a giant food source for migratory birds. And so every time we do that, it makes it a little bit more difficult for these migratory birds to find adequate food along the way. So that's more of a songbird issue, which I also greatly care about. When this is done in the nesting grounds of these birds, it's not only food, but also it's nesting territory that is removed. And so, yeah, anything we can do to reduce the rate at which, or to prevent altogether big trees from being cut down, it's worth trying to do that. You know, there is room for sustainable timber harvest, but if we can avoid cutting down old growth trees especially, and do timber harvest in a way that's sustainable, you know, trying to reduce complete clear cutting and making sure that forests are regenerating rapidly, that's really important. And as you point out, the carbon dioxide intake by plants and oxygen output is an essential ecosystem service that forests provide for humans, and it's hugely valuable. And at some point, if we keep cutting down trees faster than they're growing and being planted, then, you know, that's going to become a major problem. And certainly the carbon dioxide intake is already, we're already seeing the consequences of the loss of some of that function.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, Jason, I want to thank you again for this wonderful presentation. I think many people will be probably tuning in to the recorded program because we had quite a few registrants. And I will thank everyone out there who listened in tonight, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I want to remind you that Wolf River Conservancy is worthy, just like Delta Windbirds. We are worthy of your support. We're out there protecting bottomland hardwood forests and restoring some habitat ourselves. So Discover the Greenway is coming up starting June 18th. Should be great. Great way to support the Wolf River Greenway project. And we've got some other wonderful programs and projects which you can check out on our website, wolfriver.org. Thank you, everybody. And thanks, Jason, again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for having me.
Jason, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. I hope that was
Good
okay.
program.
Yeah.
Good program.
Thank you,
Okay.
Jason. Thanks, Kathy.
Thanks, Kelsey.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thank you, Nick.
See everybody in the morning.
Okay, sleep tight.